The ocean always looks different at night. Some nights, it's tranquil, a shimmering, dark mirror stretching endlessly into the void. Other nights, it's restless, alive with the whispers of secrets it swallowed whole. Tonight, as I stepped aboard the opulent yacht christened Elysium, it felt more like the latter. The air carried a faint tang of salt and decay, mingled with something else, a tension that pricked at the edge of my instincts. The Elysium had been missing for 4 days. When the Coast Guard finally found it adrift near Catalina Island, there was no sign of its owner, billionaire tech mogul Julian Grant. Inside, everything seemed untouched, save for a single chilling detail, a note scrawled on the wall of his cabin in what looked like black marker. It read, "The tide always takes back what's borrowed." My name is Detective Sam Thorne, and this case had trouble written all over it. Julian Grant wasn't just rich. He was Silicon Valley royalty, a genius who'd built his empire from nothing and disrupted entire industries along the way. To some, he was a visionary, to others, he was a ruthless opportunist. Either way, he'd amassed an impressive list of admirers, enemies, and everyone in between. And now he was gone, vanished without a trace from a yacht that showed no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, just that eerie note. I started my investigation in the cabin. The note was written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. No fingerprints on the marker left behind. The bed was neatly made, the small desk piled with papers, schematics, correspondence, half-written memos. I flipped through them, looking for anything unusual, but they seemed ordinary, at least for someone who invented tech I could barely comprehend. The real puzzle was the Elysium itself. It was a floating palace, decked out with the latest tech, biometric locks, surveillance cameras, and enough smart systems to put a space station to shame. Yet somehow, every single camera had gone offline 4 days ago, right around the time Grant disappeared. A glitch? Sabotage? Or something more sinister? By the time I stepped off the yacht that night, I had a working theory: Julian Grant didn't disappear. He was made to disappear. Over the next week, I dug into Grant's life. If ever there was a man whose success had bred enemies, it was him. His business rivals were legion, each with a potential grudge sharper than the last. Take Darren Locke, a former co-founder of Grant's first startup. Locke claimed Grant had squeezed him out just before their company went public, pocketing billions that should have been shared. He'd spent the last decade trying, and failing, to claw his way back to relevance. When I confronted Locke in his glass-walled office, his denials were smooth, but his eyes told a different story. Then there was the family. Julian had been estranged from his younger brother, Nate, for years. Nate had grown up in Julian's shadow, struggling to find his own identity. A few years ago, Nate had publicly accused Julian of stealing a revolutionary piece of code he developed. The legal battle was messy, ugly, and ended in Julian's favor. Nate hadn't spoken to him since. And then there was Isabella Reed, Julian's ex-wife and a fixture of tabloid headlines. Their divorce had been a spectacle, played out under the glaring lights of public scrutiny. Isabella walked away with a substantial settlement, but if the rumors were true, she wanted more, not just money, but control over the company they built together. Control Julian refused to relinquish. Each of these people had motive. Each of them had the means. But what none of them had was the answer to the cryptic message left on the wall of the yacht. And that's what kept nagging at me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. I'd been going through Julian's financials, trying to trace any unusual transactions. Most of it was what you'd expect for a billionaire: investments, properties, offshore accounts. But one transaction stood out. A monthly wire transfer to a nondescript account in the Cayman Islands, a substantial sum, but not so large that it raised immediate red flags. Digging deeper, I discovered the account was linked to a name that didn't appear anywhere else in Julian's records: Michael Gray. Curious, I followed the trail. What I found stopped me cold. Michael Gray wasn't just a pseudonym, it was a fully fleshed-out identity, complete with bank accounts, property holdings, and a passport. Julian Grant had a secret identity. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would a man like Julian need an alternate persona? Was he hiding from someone? Or was this part of a plan to disappear on his own terms? And how did it tie into the message on the wall of his cabin? As I pieced together the fragments of Julian's double life, another possibility began to take shape. What if Julian had discovered something that made him dangerous to the people around him? A game-changing invention, perhaps, or a secret so explosive it put a target on his back? The deeper I delved, the more I realized I wasn't just chasing a missing person. I was unraveling a web of deceit, greed, and betrayal that stretched far beyond Julian Grant. And the closer I got to the truth, the more I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. I didn't know where the case would lead me yet, but one thing was certain: the tide always takes back what's borrowed. And if I wasn't careful, it might take me too. The next clue came unexpectedly. Late one night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Elysium wasn't his first secret. Follow the whispers. Catalina, 33 degrees 21 minutes 28.9 seconds north, 118 degree 22 foot 01.3 inch W. The coordinates pointed to a remote cove on Catalina Island, far from the usual tourist hotspots. I knew better than to chase anonymous leads without backup, but something about the message felt urgent. If Julian Grant's disappearance had taught me anything so far, it was that whoever, or whatever, was behind this wasn't going to wait for me to play it safe. By the time I reached the cove, the moon hung low over the ocean, its silver light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The cove was eerily quiet, save for the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks. I scanned the area with my flashlight and quickly spotted something unusual: a small metal hatch embedded in the rocky outcrop, almost invisible beneath layers of moss and debris. The hatch was locked, but the edges were rusted, and with a little effort, and a crowbar I'd brought just in case, I managed to pry it open. A ladder led down into darkness, the air below carrying a faint metallic tang. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I descended. The ladder ended in a narrow corridor lined with concrete walls. I followed it, my footsteps echoing faintly as I moved deeper underground. Finally, I reached a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open revealed what looked like a makeshift laboratory. The room was packed with equipment, servers humming softly, monitors displaying streams of code, and vials of unknown substances. On one of the desks was a collection of journals, each labeled with a single word: Erebus. As I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightened. The journals detailed experiments, illegal, unethical, and groundbreaking. If what I was reading was true, Julian Grant had been working on something far beyond anything he'd ever publicly revealed. One entry caught my eye. Erebus is the key. Not just to the future, but to survival. They can't know until it's ready. If they find out, I'm as good as dead. A sound behind me froze me in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. I turned off my flashlight and ducked behind a row of servers, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just inside the room. Detective Thorne, a voice said, calm and measured. You've made it further than I expected. I stepped out from my hiding spot, keeping my hand near my sidearm. The man standing before me was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. He wore a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the dank underground lab. Who are you? I demanded. Let's just say I represent certain interests, he replied, his tone as smooth as glass. Interests that would prefer Erebus remains buried. Erebus isn't just some tech project, is it? I said, watching him closely. What is it? Why is Julian Grant missing? The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're asking the wrong questions, detective. The real question is, how much longer can you afford to keep digging before the tide takes you under? Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the room filled with the sound of approaching footsteps, many of them. Whoever this man was, he wasn't alone. I had two choices: stay and fight, or take what I'd learned and get the hell out of there. Grabbing one of the journals, I bolted for the exit, the sound of shouting and running footsteps chasing me up the ladder and into the night. Back on the surface, I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I sped away, my mind raced. Erebus, the secret lab, the mysterious man, it was all connected. But to what? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: Julian Grant hadn't just disappeared. He'd stumbled into something much bigger, something dangerous. And now, so had I. The tide wasn't just coming for Julian anymore. It was coming for me, too. Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. I pored over the stolen journal, cross-referencing its cryptic notes with the fragments of Julian's life I had pieced together. Words like neural convergence, quantum resonance, and cognitive singularity appeared over and over, but they meant little to me. What stood out was a recurring phrase: the silent current. Whatever the silent current was, Julian believed it could change everything. And judging by the lengths people were willing to go to bury it, they believed it too. The journal also contained coordinates, several, in fact. One was the lab I'd already found. Another pointed to a facility deep in the Mojave Desert. But the most intriguing was the last: 36 degrees 58 minutes 22 seconds north, 122 degrees 0 minutes 50 seconds west, a location just off the coast of Monterey Bay. I decided to start there. If I was going to find answers, I needed to get ahead of whoever was hunting me. The coordinates led to a nondescript warehouse at the edge of the bay, shrouded in fog and almost invisible from the main road. The building looked abandoned, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, but a faint hum emanated from within. It wasn't completely lifeless. I slipped inside, gun drawn, and found myself in what looked like a loading dock. Crates were stacked against the walls, some marked with the logo of Grant's company, Ionis Systems. As I moved deeper, the hum grew louder until I entered a cavernous chamber filled with machines I couldn't begin to comprehend. At the center of the room was a massive cylindrical structure, its surface shimmering with faint, otherworldly light. Before I could get closer, a voice cut through the air. "Detective Thorne. You're persistent, I'll give you that." I turned to see Julian Grant himself stepping out of the shadows. He looked gaunt, his green eyes sharper than I remembered from photos, but there was an intensity about him that hadn't dulled. "You're alive," I said, lowering my gun slightly. "What the hell is going on, Grant? People think you're dead. There's a kill squad after me because of you." He chuckled, a hollow sound. "If only it were that simple." "I didn't disappear, Detective, I went to ground. And not because of the people you've met so far. They're just pawns. The real threat is bigger than you can imagine." I gestured to the glowing machine. This is the threat?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I call it Erebus. It's a doorway, Detective. A way to tap into the silent current." "And what is the silent current?" He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Think of it as the collective consciousness of humanity, every thought, every memory, every spark of genius, all flowing together in an invisible network we can't normally perceive. Erebus lets us access it. But the problem is, the current isn't just knowledge. It's also emotion. Fear. Anger. Greed. Tap into it without control, and you unleash chaos." "So you built a machine that could destroy the world?" I said, incredulous. "I built a machine to save it," he snapped. "Do you know what's coming? Climate collapse. Resource wars. Mass extinction. We're out of time, Detective. The silent current is our only chance to unify, to think and act as one species. But others, they don't see it that way. They see Erebus as a weapon. And if they get their hands on it..." He didn't need to finish. The implications were clear. "Why the note on the wall?" I asked. "The tide always takes back what's borrowed." "What does it mean?" He smiled faintly. "A reminder. The silent current isn't ours to control. It belongs to something greater, something older. If we misuse it, the current will take it back. And us with it. Before I could respond, the warehouse lights flickered. Julian froze, his expression darkening. They're here. We barely made it to the back exit before the strike team stormed the warehouse, their movements precise and deadly. Julian led me to a hidden escape route, a narrow tunnel that emerged near the shoreline. As we crouched behind a cluster of rocks, he handed me a small data drive. Everything you need to stop them is on here, he said. Names, locations, proof of what they're planning. But be careful, detective. Once you expose this, you'll never be safe again. What about you? I asked. He shook his head. They'll never stop hunting me as long as I'm alive. I need to disappear for good this time. I wanted to argue, but there was no time. The strike team was closing in, their flashlights cutting through the fog. Julian gave me one last look, a mix of gratitude and regret, before slipping into the water and vanishing beneath the waves. In the weeks that followed, I used the data drive to blow the lid off the conspiracy. The names on the list included tech executives, government officials, even military contractors, all of them tied to a shadowy organization intent on weaponizing Erebus. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Arrests were made. Careers ended. But Erebus itself? It vanished, just like Julian. I'd like to think he destroyed it, but part of me knows better. Julian Grant wasn't the kind of man to abandon his vision, no matter the cost. Somewhere out there, he's still working on Erebus, trying to save humanity from itself. As for me, I'm back to chasing cases, pretending life is normal. But every time I hear the oceans whisper, I wonder. The tide always takes back what's borrowed. I just hope I'm not next.